So I wanted to talk today about the bonsai industrial complex a little bit. What I've got here in my hand is an example of the kind of tree that I think a lot of people get as their first tree. This is what's called a dwarf elm. There are a lot of different species of dwarfed trees. Elm is just one of them. You can get dwarfed varieties of cypresses, and I did a video a little while back on a dwarf Japanese maple that I've got. There are a lot of species that have been dwarfed. And by dwarf, what I mean is that it has basically been bred in order to grow very, very slowly and in a more compact kind of way. So as you can see, this tree has elm-shaped leaves. I don't know if you can see up close, but this has leaves that look like an elm tree, but they're way smaller than a typical elm tree's leaves. Also, it's obviously growing in a very compact kind of way, and a normal elm tree wouldn't grow like this. It would grow much taller and spindlier, and the branches would be much farther apart. So that's how you can tell this is a dwarf. I'm going to talk a little bit about why you might get a tree like this and why you might avoid it. So these kinds of trees, first of all, where do you find them? You probably wouldn't find dwarf varieties of bonsai in most professional bonsai nurseries. I mean, you might, but this kind of stuff, this kind of stock isn't really what most professional bonsais would stock up on. You're more likely to find this kind of stuff in like a professional nursery that isn't focused on bonsai, but it's a full range nursery and they've got lots of stuff, and they might have some of this. You might find it in like a mall store, and I've seen these sold in like stores that are stocked with stuff that are geared towards like hippie kind of stores, and also sometimes like tourist oriented stores like gift shop stores will sell stock like this. And sometimes it's an elm, sometimes it's a ficus, because ficuses are really kind of dramatic and they're easy to grow inside and outside. Junipers are also really commonly sold in places like this, and they're attractive to people who generally don't know much about bonsai. This is actually a tree that I got for my daughter, and she picked it out. I was trying to kind of steer her towards material that I thought would make for a better bonsai, but she picked this, and that's kind of my point, is that to her this kind of looks like what a bonsai should look like. It sort of looks like a tiny tree, teeny tiny little tree in a teeny tiny little pot, and it's got lots of healthy leaves on it that are nice and tiny, and so it sort of looks to her like what a bonsai should look like. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's okay, and that's why I got it for. Ultimately, at the end of the day, if you like what a tree looks like, that's what you should be focused on. But this has some characteristics that we would not be looking for in like a good quality tree, and I'll get into that in a second. So people who generally don't know a lot about what they're looking for are more likely to be drawn to these kinds of trees, because it sort of looks like in their mind what a bonsai should look like. Let's talk a little bit about some of the advantages. What are some of the good qualities of this kind of material? First of all, it's got tiny little leaves, as I said, and they're really compact. Trees like this, dwarf trees, may grow only a centimeter in a year, put on maybe a centimeter of leaf growth in a year, maybe even less than that depending on the species. So these things grow really slowly, and so they tend to develop these leaves that are very compact and close together, and that makes it look sort of like a mature tree, right? Another example of a species that I've got here that is often used, is often dwarfed and sold in these kinds of stores. This is a sarissa, also called a snow rose. Sarissas are very pretty little bushes. They develop little flowers on them that are very pretty. They're also quite slow growing, and you can sort of tell that because the leaves here are very compact and tight together. Sarissas are lovely little trees, but just like the dwarf elm, they take a long time to get big, and that's one of the downsides from a certain perspective. So it's got nice compact leaves that are small, close together, healthy looking, very dense, bushy kind of look here. You can also see how the leaves are all kind of piled up at the top here, and there's not a whole lot in the bottom. And that does kind of look like a mature tree might look, right? This is a fairly natural kind of appearance, and that helps give it a sort of an old tree appearance that's quite desirable. What's not so good about it aesthetically is that the trunk is also quite thin. So you can see here that the trunk is, not much more than a quarter of an inch in diameter. And there's nothing wrong with that in particular, but people who know bonsai and really study this stuff, what we focus on is the trunk. The trunk is perhaps one of the key elements of a good bonsai. And what we look for is typically a thick trunk that has a lot of character to it. Maybe it has some curves, maybe it has some interesting bark texture, maybe it has some damage to it that gives it some character and makes it look sort of like an old tree that's seen a lot of hard times. The trunk is really important, and it's the hardest thing to get right in a bonsai because the trunk is the slowest growing part. It takes the longest to develop, and it's very hard to change once it's in place, right? You can't, if you've got a really straight trunk, once it gets beyond a certain level of thickness, you're not going to be able to change the shape of that trunk very easily. It's just too thick. And even at this point, this trunk here, I could not bend this to make it more interesting. But it's fairly thin, and it's also quite straight. It's okay, which sort of fits the style, which is sort of a broom style of tree. We might call this a broom style, I guess. And that kind of fits actually. But if we were looking for like a higher quality tree, we'd want something that maybe has this same style of branches up top, but is thicker in the bottom part and has a lot more character in the trunk. But that's hard to get in a dwarf species because, again, these dwarf species take such a long time to grow. It could take many decades to develop a really thick trunk. And that's why these kinds of trees tend to be mass-produced and sold to consumers who don't know a whole lot about trees, because it doesn't take all that long to develop this kind of look, which looks like a bonsai. And another positive thing about it is that it doesn't require much work. You don't have to do anything to make this look attractive. You don't have to do a lot of pruning and shaping and wiring. It already comes pre-made, pretty much in a bonsai kind of appearance. And that's another positive quality if you're not looking to put much effort into your tree. And that's why they're mass-produced and sold like that. But one of the downsides is that it's got that thin trunk that's probably never going to get really big unless you own it for a really long time. That's a downside. The other downside for beginners is that these trees will often be sold in pretty tiny pots because they're tiny trees already. And by the way, I should say that there's actually a word term for that kind of tree. You can make a really tiny bonsai, by the way, and really tiny bonsai are called mame bonsai. Mame bonsai could be, maybe this big, and they can be great, high-quality trees. But again, one of the key elements for a good mame is that it's got to have a really interesting trunk. And usually it's going to have a pretty thick trunk to it. So if you do a Google search for mame, spelled M-A-M-E, you'll find examples of what I'm talking about. Another term for it, for small bonsai, is shohin, and shohin bonsai is maybe bigger than mame. I don't the rules about what makes it shohin versus mame is somewhat fuzzy. It's just that mame is the tiniest kind of bonsai and shohin is a little bigger. Anyway, so the other problem is that with these tiny trees is that they get sold in these tiny little pots. And if you remember what I said when I talked about the most common reason why people kill their trees, it's because they're underwatered and they dry out. And they dry out because bonsai have tiny little root balls in these tiny little pots. Now, these small trees have particularly tiny root balls in particularly tiny pots, which means that they are even less tolerant to drought and dryness than your typical bonsai. So what a lot of people will do with these trees is they'll buy them, they look pretty, they look cute, and they might put them, say, like on a windowsill in their house, like right up against the glass. That's problematic and usually a really bad idea for two reasons. One, because if that window gets much direct sunlight makes glass really hot, and you know this from your car. If you touch glass that the sun has been warming up, it is burning hot. And so not only is the glass really hot, but the air right next to the glass is also hotter than the average room temperature. So when you stick a tree up against glass that gets direct light, it could get so hot that it will burn the leaves, kill the leaves, and it will also dry out the soil much faster than it would already happen in a normal room. And so it's very easy for the soil to get totally dried out within a few hours, basically for your tree to get cooked. And that's how a lot of people kill their first tree, putting it next to the windowsill in a tiny little pot like this, and they just don't know. So if you're not prepared to pay a lot of close attention to your tree and try to water it maybe multiple times a day, depending on how hot it is and sunny, I might not put a plant like this next to a window. So that's a common mistake, and again, even if you keep it outside, because of the shallow pot, the small root ball, these things are prone to die more easily than your regular tree. So as a starter tree, it has some appeal. It has a naturally pleasant appearance that you don't have to put a lot of work into, but it has some downsides. These are easier to kill, and it's probably not going to give you a high quality bonsai like more experienced professionals or amateurs like myself look for in a good quality tree. But that said, that's not a reason to not buy a tree like this. If you like how it looks and you enjoy taking care of it, that's all that really matters. Okay, so I'm not trying to be really judgmental here for people who buy trees like this. There's nothing wrong with it. I'm just trying to help you see that it's a more of an undeveloped kind of person who looks for this kind of a tree. People just haven't had a lot of training or education in what a good tree looks like. So again, it's fine if you like it, but it's not going to win any competition awards, is my point. So that's pretty much all I had to say about dwarf trees for right now. I may do other videos on other kinds of material like this, but I hope this gives you a sense of the good and the bad about dwarf trees. And if you have any questions about anything, just ask me in the comments section and I'll try to answer any questions. So hope you enjoyed it, hope you found it useful, and take care.